All right, so I don't want to take too much more time. I want to get started with this. I guess I'll reintroduce myself for the sake of the video. I'm Rob Ribeiro, and this is D3 and C3 for you. I want to make sure I reached out to those who only speak text speak. A little bit about me. I work for a company called Apparatus. They're located in Indianapolis. I'm a senior consultant there. For them, I do .NET, JavaScript, Angular, and in my free time, I like to mess around with a little bit of Node.js. I have a daughter named Avery, who's 2, and very hyperactive. And when I'm not dealing with one of the other things, I am a level 38 Warlock on Destiny. I'll let you guess what my PSN screen name is. It's already up there twice. Maybe I'm on Twitter if you have any thoughts. I usually talk about grilling and development and complaining about bad retail environments. That's about all I put on my Twitter. And I blog on my website. So D3 and C3, that's what we're talking about tonight. And hoping some people have an idea of what D3 is, but if not, we'll get into that. I thought it was one of these guys, but I'm not sure. No? Wrong? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what D3 is. D3 stands for Data-Driven Documents. It's not a very descriptive name in terms of what it actually does, though. So the idea behind D3, when people hear about it, they usually hear about it like, oh, it makes charts and graphs. It's actually a much lower level library than that. It's designed for the art of DOM manipulation and binding data to the DOM. So the first part of that, DOM manipulation, you start to think, the first thing you should probably start thinking of there is things like jQuery. It's actually, some of the elements of D3 can replace jQuery in your everyday usage. If you're just trying to grab a DOM element, pull it out, and append some things to it or swap some classes on it, you can actually do that same thing with D3 and not need jQuery anymore. But one of the things that it's gotten really well known for is its use in creating SVG visualizations. So creating beautiful charts, graphs, things like that, that may even be interactive in a website. And one of the other things that's really interesting about D3 is that it takes a declarative approach. So those who are more familiar with functional languages and with SQL, D3's approach is not going to be this imperative, we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this. It's kind of more like a state machine, where we're going to say, these are the kinds of things that we're going to do, we're going to set these, even a state machine is kind of wrong, maybe going the wrong direction. We're going to kind of say what this graph should do for all the data elements in it. It'll make more sense when we actually get through some of the examples. Went ahead and included what browsers you can use this for. It's basically all major browsers, i.e. beware anything below version 9, but it's good for just about everything else there. Now we've talked about SVG, but we haven't talked about what SVG is. SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. Some people may be used to being able to export this kind of format. I believe Illustrate from Adobe Illustrator, you can export SVG graphics. The idea here is that you can make XML-based vector images by using vectors. I feel like scalable vector graphics is somewhat redundant there because vector images are usually by nature scalable because you're just defining the direction and magnitude that something should be relative to something else. So you can scale that up on like a rasterized image. And being XML based, we're rendering things based on tags, attributes, just the same way we do with HTML. You can even style SVG with CSS, which is one of the convenient things. And you use elements, the big elements that we'll be working with tonight are rect, which is for rectangle, circle, which I hope you figure out what that one is. If not, probably the wrong space. G is an interesting one. I believe it stands for group, if I remember correctly. Best way I can describe it is it's the SVG analog kind of to a div. So from HTML, so you can put a bunch of things together inside of it. That's its main purpose, which makes it really easy to manipulate things. And then text, which again, I hope you can figure out what that one is. So we're going to be seeing a lot of mentions of SVG tags. We're not going to see a whole lot of actual, except if I actually pull up some of the DevTools stuff. We're not going to see a ton of SVG tags because a lot of this stuff can be generated by D3. But just so you can get an idea of what this stuff looks like, for those familiar with HTML, but maybe not familiar with SVG or regular old XML, it's very tag oriented. You start with an open and close of an SVG element, and you define a space of a certain size, and then inside that you just start drawing stuff. So here we've got a 50 by 50 pixel space, and we draw a circle inside of it that is dead center. So center, the x center of the, the x coordinate of the center of the circle is at 25, y coordinate of the center of the circle is at 25, and the radius is 10. So we're going to get a circle that's about 20 pixels tall, dead center in this space. Now the other things that are interesting here, just so you get an idea, because we're not going to talk too much about color and styling and stuff like that outside of this. This spot is fill, stroke, and stroke width. So you're probably used to things like color and background and a couple other CSS properties. Because we're dealing with SVG elements, those properties are different. So stroke, fill is going to be your background color. That's the actual fill of the object. And stroke is going to be your outline color, and stroke width is the width of that outline. The only big things to point out, so what we end up with is a yellow circle with an orange outline. That orange outline is 5 pixels wide. It's 2.5 pixels in, 2.5 pixels out. So that's the width of the stroke itself, both in and out. It's not the width of the stroke outside the circle. You can even do really interesting things with transparencies. Like if you make your stroke have a transparent color or a partially transparent color, you'll actually get like a bullseye effect because you'll have the center fill, you'll have the overlay between the stroke and the fill, and then you'll have the stroke outside of that. So you can do some interesting effects with that. We're not going to see a lot of those, but I wanted to, this is my only chance to give any sort of real treatment of SVG, so I wanted to make sure we took a moment to do that. So DOM manipulation. There are 5 key methods with DOM manipulation that we're going to talk about tonight. Select, select all, append, adder, and style. Select and select all, select all, and append are things that you're very used to from selecting elements, selecting and manipulating elements in jQuery. So select is select the first one of these with a particular selector. Select all is get them all with that selector. And append, then you chain onto one of those to append some other tag inside of that as a child. Adder and style then are used to change attributes on, adder is for changing attributes on that on whatever element that you're on, and style is for doing styling changes on that as well. So the syntax is standard CSS selector syntax. So if you have something, if you're trying to select an ID, you use a pound and then the ID. If you're doing a class and you just say you're doing select all in a class, dot class name. It's fairly standard stuff. You want to do a tag, let's say a P tag. Just put quote P quote. That's your selector. So let's do a little example of some of this. And all of our examples tonight will be courtesy of JS Fiddle. This one I actually wanted you guys to see the console on because a lot of this stuff is going to be in the console here in this one. So,
question on this.
Sure.
If we all get access to this on our computer, how does that work in terms of, I guess, client versus server?
So D3 is all, unless you were to pre-render this, there are some technologies nowadays that can pre-run your JavaScript server-side and serve the whole page completed. Generally speaking, this is probably something you're going to run client-side because D3 is a client-side JavaScript library. I'm sure you could, with something server-side like in Node.js, you could probably emulate a DOM and do all this stuff server-side. But generally speaking, this is something you would include in a script tag on your page, either by You either have D3.js sitting on your server, or you'd be linking to a CDN. So, apologize. I probably should have included that back on the D3 slide. So, does that answer the question? Let's see if I can get a little more. There we go. So, we've got some HTML up here. We've got 3 divs. Each of them have unique IDs. 2 of them have classes that we're calling div crew. They're part of the div crew. Little guy's not so cool, he didn't think he was the crew. And so we're going to demo out select, for example. We're going to select that div, which was the middle one here. And then we're going to go ahead and log out the text inside of that. And one thing to point out is this is where we're starting to see some of the D3 stuff come in. So not only are we doing a select, there's an each function that select kicks back an array, even though you're only supposed to be selecting one. The same thing happens with select all. So either one of these you can do with each. This context that's sent into the callback then is the element itself. So when you see this there, we're talking about the element that was selected, or in this case, one of the elements that we're iterating over that was selected in select all. And then we're going to go ahead and get the text that was in that. So I'm going to log out from that div. I got second. When I do a select on div crew, now remember we've got 2 of them, we only get first because we only grab the first one. And then we do a select all on div crew. That should get us both of them. And then the each should iterate them, and we get first and third, which is what we get. And then, just so you can see what happens when we start to do some append, so we're actually manipulating the DOM, not just querying through it. We're going to go ahead and select the body, append a div, set the attribute of class to div crew, and set its text to surprise. And you'll see that we rendered out surprise over here, even though it wasn't in our HTML up here. And when we do one more query where we do a select all in div crew, we end up with, so we did it once with first and third, we do it again, we get first, third, surprise. So it's able to look at the DOM in the current state, not just not just whatever HTML was originally loaded. So actually I want to come back to one more thing here. Now you're going to see attr with 2 different syntaxes in here. One of the options is you can pass an object to it, and the properties of that object are the various attributes, and the values are the values that you should set with them. The other option is you can pass in a string for the attribute name, and then the second item will be the value to be set there. So if you only need to do one attribute, you can do the simplest syntax of just name, attribute, name, comma, attribute. If you're going to be doing a lot of them, which you'll see in a number of spots, you'll do a whole object. So now we get to data binding. And those of you who've worked with Angular, with Knockout, with there's plenty of other libraries out there that do data binding. This is not at all what you think it is. Normally when we talk about data binding, we're talking about some sort of two-way thing where I can say this JavaScript property is bound to some input or some button on the DOM, and when somebody makes a change to it, that change is reflected back into my JavaScript. That's not what we're talking about doing here. Instead, we're talking about declaratively attaching data to DOM elements. So to reference last month's talk on React, it's a little more declarative one time. You have to kind of run a cycle to actually put something into the DOM. It's a loose analogy there. I'm not going to. This is nowhere near the same thing as React even, but to try to get an idea, this is one-way data binding. And the key methods that we're going to mess with here are data, enter, and exit. We're not going to see exit yet, but we'll take a quick look here at what data and enter do. All right, so I'm defining a data set, 5, 10, 15, 60, and 99. And then what we're going to do is we're going to grab the body, we're going to select all p tags. Now the funny thing is we don't have any p tags. This is where that sort of declarative part comes in. we're saying we want to select all the p tags that could exist. The best way I can kind of describe it. And we're going to attach to them the data set. Now, for anything that doesn't exist, we're going to run the stuff that follows enter. So enter is a way of referencing things that could exist but don't. And what chains after enter is what we're going to do to enter those elements, those missing elements into the DOM. This idea of why enter took me a long time to wrap my head around, but the idea really here is, and it becomes more obvious when you get down the road, when we get to transitions and stuff, is this is really what happens when things enter into the DOM, because there's the data that they represent that's bound to them has not been pulled into the DOM onto anything yet. Does that make sense? You know, that's kind of weird as a topic.
If they do exist, does it identify which one's already there, or is it?
Hold that thought.
Okay.
We're gonna get to that one because that becomes a problem actually.
Okay.
That's actually going to be a problem, and we're going to talk about that. So, enter is what happens when we're bringing in data that doesn't exist. And so, what we're going to do is when we bring in a piece of data, we're going to append a p tag, we're going to set its text using a function, and we're going to style its color. So let's go back to the text. And you get two parameters. The first one is data, the actual value in the array. And if it's an object, then you're getting, if we're using a simple example of a bunch of integers here. If we were to actually put objects into this array, it would be the object in the array. So if your value was actually some property of that, you would need to do, d dot value or d dot whatever you're trying to put out there. If the index matters to you, which in many cases it will, we'll see where it does matter in some of these functions. You have that available as well. So we just spit out, here's number 0 through 4, indicating their indices in the array and their values. You'll notice also the color changes because we have a function that actually sets the text color to the value of the digit, or the value of the data, plus 2 more zeros. So we should be seeing things that approach orange? Yellow, sorry. Yellow. Sorry, it took me a second. So we should be seeing things that approach yellow, and in fact, when we get to 99, we do start to see things approaching yellow. But when they're lower, like 10 and 10, we would get color 10, 10, 00. Now the first one's actually an error, but we don't care about that, and it just ends up throwing black in there. Now the one last thing I wanted to show you actually requires me to go ahead and open console, and that is, I went ahead and selected the first paragraph that got added, and for whatever reason, there's 2 arrays nested inside of each other, but underscore underscore data underscore underscore is the property added by D3 to bind the data value from our data set to the DOM element. And you can see that we do in fact get 5 off of the very first p tag. So the data that we shot in there, if it was an object, if whatever it is, does in fact get attached to the DOM element itself.
Do they use data attribute tags to put that number on there, or are they just writing it straight to the text of it?
Say that again?
Yeah, you have the data dash tags.
It's just a job. I mean, we're just talking about it's not alter. Yeah. That's not really what they're doing here. They're just attaching to the DOM node JavaScript, like to the DOM node object. They're attaching a property to it. It's not about it's not actually altering the attributes in that sense. I don't even know if you could dig into the element to find it on there from the point of view of looking at the elements view here. I don't think you'd even see it.
I don't think you can.
Yeah, I went looking for it to find an easy way to do it, and what I ended up with was doing a console log because I wanted to make sure that we talked about what this is actually doing. That data part, the part where we hit this data call, that's the operative piece that's binding this array to a bunch of DOM nodes. So let's do our first chart of sorts. we're going to do a scatter plot with SVG using circles. And the note we're probably going to cover anyway in here, but I want to make sure we call it out no matter what. 0, 0, x0, x0, y0 is in the upper left-hand corner instead of the lower left-hand corner. So that causes us some difficulties when our data, our y values, for example, should be height from the bottom. And we're going to see this not be correct here, actually. Okay. Let's see if we can get a little more space here. So this time we've got a data set. It's an array of arrays, so x and y is essentially what we're trying to represent here. And this is our first time really trying to put the whole thing together, so I'm going to walk us through what this code's doing. So we're going to select the body, we're going to append an SVG element, so we have a canvas. When I say canvas, I don't mean HTML5 canvas, I mean something to work with. We have a canvas to draw on, not HTML5 canvas. And then we're going to set the attributes for the width and height of that to 200 by 200. And then we're going to go ahead and select all G's. And we talked about that before. G is group, so we're going to be able to do groupings. And the reason I like that is because I want to be able to have a container that both my circle and my text that you see on the right can go together into. We're going to go ahead and attach that data. And as we enter our data, each one's going to append a G. Now, instead of having to continue off of this chain, I can start to work with those individual G elements. So we're going to go ahead and select all of the groups. We're going to go ahead and append a circle. And we're going to go ahead and set them to, we're going to set their centers, and then we're going to set the radius just to 5, so that they're all the same over there. Now, once again, we're seeing that function syntax where we can pass in the data and the index from our data set. Now, in this case, our data is the array, so we access the first element, x, which is our x. So D0 is supposed to be our x coordinate, D1 is supposed to be our y. And so that we can get some spread here, we go ahead and multiply each of those by 5, because we need to scale them up somehow. I'll show you what this looks like without that. It's not very useful. So we need to have some way of scaling this, but this could become problematic over time. If we just hard code some value 5, well then what if the values get bigger? We're gonna see. This is called foreshadowing, guys. So we go ahead and we can pass in D and I. We actually don't need the index of this one. And then we're gonna go ahead and start appending text. So once again, we can go to each of those G's, and the way that D3 works is because we have a reference to, G is not one group, but it's the group of, it is the array of the groups. And when we use, it's the array of the groups wrapped, no, let me try that again. It's the array of D3 wrapped group nodes. Does that make sense? It's a better way of putting it. So when we continue to chain off of this array, D3 knows what to continue to do. So I can take, that's how I can take G and append circles to it, and then take G and append text to it, and it knows to iterate correctly over all of those items. So just kind of going back to that, we're not being so procedural as we're being more declarative. We're saying these groups should have this thing on it, and then these groups should have this kind of a thing on it. So we're going to go ahead then and append the text, and we're going to just put the x comma y, which is the blue text you see over there. We're going to go ahead and set the x and y values so that they are next to the points. And then using similar syntax to what we had up here, we have to offset x a little bit so that it's not sitting right on top of the point. And then we go ahead and set some font styling there so that we can actually, give it a color, give it a size, that kind of thing. So.
Can I ask a question about the screen? So in your first block up there, so from your previous example, select all and then some element type. That's what you're about to be creating, right? Based on your data set. I'm just trying to intuitively understand.
So select all allows me to start grabbing DOM elements.
Right.
Now we can do that either to grab actual DOM elements that exist and then start operating on them, or in the case, this is more of a special case of it up here. When I'm planning to attach data, we need to write sort of a query that's going to describe what we're selecting. It's hard to wrap your head around this first part of it because it's not what you would expect to do.
The thing that kind of threw me off is it seems like redundant that you're saying, I'm about to make G's and then you're appending G's. You know what I mean at the end there? I'm not really sure.
So it is weird.
Okay.
And I'm trying to wrap around. It's a struggle to really describe this well.
Okay.
And I'm probably not going to do it. So, but the idea here is that we're saying that a group of G's is what we would like.
Okay.
And we're going to attach this data set to those G's. And as we enter those elements, if they're not there, to do so, we append a G.
Okay.
Does that make more sense?
What, I guess maybe you'll have other examples. Could you have done other appends there? What would have happened if you had appended G or something? I don't know.
Let's try this.
So
Let's go ahead and change this. Apparently it still works there. Every example, so I read a book. I actually read something here, and every example that you start with starts with this.
Okay.
I don't know what the ramifications are. Let's do this. Let's go ahead and get rid of the select all. Well, that doesn't work anymore.
No.
So you have to have some sort of
Yeah.
queried collection for this to
I wonder
work.
what happens if can you get rid of it on the append? Can you just append without a specific?
Get rid of this.
Can you get rid of the G parameter on the append?
I don't know.
This, I need this because I'm actually telling it what I'm going to put in there.
I see what you're saying, but since we're selecting all G's up there, you don't need to actually put anything in append, you just close the I wonder, I never tried it that way before.
And we're going to get into some other places where we're going to, this select all syntax is still going to be useful in other places. Yeah, it's a really good point. I don't know why it still works, I can't tell you.
Oh, yeah.
Charlie?
So if you had empty G tags up in your HTML, could you remove the enter?
If I had, I don't believe so. Because the issue there, one, the SVG doesn't exist yet. And two, the other issue, so we're looking for G elements that are under the SVG. The other issue is that, again, I've tried this, so I don't know what would happen, but this is under our, I think we would still end up entering 5 Gs because we don't have data attached properly to the Gs that, if I put 5 Gs in the DOM, pre-populated file of them, unless there was data attached to them, I don't think it would work. I'm speculating here, but I don't have an answer for that one, unfortunately. Better ideas don't. No, actually, one thing I should have pointed out here. Let's go back so that we can see this as it was. The one last point that I brought up in the slide is, so 134, that's 1 over 34 down from the top. So if we were trying to show this as meaningful data, this is all backwards from the way that we conventionally see data. All of this should be flipped.
So when you said that, is that because SVG starts 0, 0 up here?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's that combined with how I told it to do this. So if I do 200 minus and cross my fingers that I'm remembering to do this correctly. Bam. Flip the whole graph upside down because I now have taken 200, the height of it, minus the value I actually want. Well, minus 5 times the value I actually want.
Because that's the width of your dip.
Right. The height of
the depth of your dip.
Right. Does that make sense? So this is, once again, we have this weird problem with, and then what happens if someone resizes it and stuff like that? So let's deal with that right now. Scaling. Now we're gonna go ahead and do a bar chart using SVG rectangles. And the idea here is that we're gonna map an input or a domain to an output or a range. So we have this set of values that we have to start with coming in. We'll call that the domain or our input. And we're going to map that over to a range of values. And we can do this on different kinds of scales. We can do it ordinally, which is what a bar chart does, because you may have A's, B's, and C's. You may have 1s, 2s, and 3s, but they're not necessarily correlated to each other in a value sense. They're just different classifications for that scale. You also have things like, one of the most common ones for like a scatter plot would be linear. So your X scale is linear, your Y scale is linear. You want to scale, graph those things that way. And there are other scales. There's logarithmic scales. They have time series scales. There's a bunch of them that we're just not going to talk about because D3 is just too large for us to give it any sort of reasonable, full treatment in the time we've got. But let's go ahead and we're going to talk about the ordinal and linear, because in a bar chart we have ordinal groupings along the x-axis and we have linear scale along the y-axis. So this time we're going to go ahead and store our heights and widths into variables. We have a much larger data set. And now we're going to go ahead and set our ordinal scale, which is our x scale. So we call D3 scale ordinal. And then we chain onto that the domain. And that domain we're going to go ahead and set based on the length of data set up here. So we go from 0 to the length of the data set. That is our x range of ordinal values. If I actually, if I can't do it here, we're going to well, I can't, I'm trying to think how to, I don't want to show you a website that I'm going to show later because it's going to spoil the surprise. So let me see if I can do this here. Just so you see what comes out of this. There we go. So when I call D3 range 5, I get an array 0 through 4. So we actually end up, this is actually slightly incorrect. There, now it's correct. So we're actually going to get an array that goes from 0 to the length of the array minus 1, inclusive on both ends. And then we do something, so we take this domain of 0 to, I don't know, I'm going to guess 20. I'm not going to count it right now. But we do this range of 0 to 19. We're going to map it through what's called range round bands, and we're kind of doing this in the wrong order because range round bands is a more complicated concept. But the idea here is that we're going to say, map these values to chunks that are pixel perfect with a little extra room, 5% to be specific, so that we can have these pixel chunks for the widths of all of our bars. And just to prove that that's exactly what's happening, we're going to change that from 5% to 50%, and the gutters just got bigger. Now we'll see in a minute how that actually changes the gutters. But let's try and wrap our heads around something a little simpler, and that is Y scale. So we're going to take a linear scale, and we're going to map in, the domain is 0. Now if you knew your data started at 10,000, you'd want to start the bottom of your scale at 10,000. But in this case, most graphs you want to start at 0 so that you can be honest about your full heights. So we're starting at 0, and we're going to the max value inside of our data set. So D3 builds in a nice max function for your arrays. They have a built-in min function. We've got a whole bunch of other helper methods and stuff that we're not going to have a chance to cover in a ton of depth. And we're going to map that to a range of 0 to the height of the bars. So That means that 0 in the domain is a value of 0, and in this case 25, I believe, is our tallest. 25 is going to be mapped. If we were to put in 25, we should get out 250, because that's the height. Alright, so let's move on. We select our body, we append an SVG, we set the width and height. That's all great. We do, on that SVG, we select all rectangles, which don't exist. We bind our data. We now declare how new data should be entered into the DOM. We append our rectangle. Now we set attributes, and here's where those scale functions come in. So our x value of the rectangle should be set to the x scaling of the index. So for element 0, the first one in the array, we're going to go ahead and shove its index into the x scale function, and it's going to go ahead and pop out the x value for us that we want for this. So this is why the scaling functions are so powerful, because now we don't have to worry about, should I do it times 5? I don't have to be concerned about the actual spacing along the axis. We can go ahead and have D3 automatically handle the scaling as long as we make sure the scale functions are set up correctly. The rest is all taken care of. Same thing happens on Y, but this time, once again, because we care about the upper left-hand corner problem, we're doing the height minus the Y scale, and the Y scale is based on the data, because the data is what we want to the data value is what we want represented in the height. So we want to scale that value and put that in Y. We talked about those range round bands at the top here with X to get those pixel perfect widths. That's exactly what we're doing. So the width of our bars should be based on the range band, this function range band on X scale. And then we go ahead and set the height. The height then is the Y scale. So the rectangles are drawn, I'm hoping I get this correct here. The rectangles are drawn from the upper left-hand corner down to the lower right. So we said our height was 200, and then we minus our Y scale. So we say, in this case, 200 minus the scaled 5 value gets us here. And then we need to draw all the way down. Sorry, I lost my place. We need to draw the height of that box down to Y scale, or by the amount of Y scale, I should say, which gets us back down to H. If you're starting here, here's H minus Y scale, draw back down to Y scale, gets us back to H. So that's how we get all of our bars to be lined up along the bottom there. Does that make sense?
Say it one more time.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
So we start.
The whole thing.
I wasn't sure if you were serious. I'd be happy to do it. I'd be happy to do it. And then we do a fill, and you'll notice this nice gradient that we're getting. Does it show up nicely there?
Yeah.
It's a little blown out. On my screen, it's a little more pronounced. Like there's a gradient coming from dark to a bright blue, back down to like a medium here. So that's because we're actually changing our fill value, which is a much better way to do the fill value than the way I did it before. I was hacking it in and I forgot about this method. So we're going ahead and giving some other context to the data. If you had another set of values to map in here, you could have something else being represented by the color, while the height of the bar was representing your magnitude of one of the values. So, and we go ahead and create our labels so that you can see numbers here, and that's done by appending text. And the text, so we append a text element and we set the text of the text element to the data value. And then we go ahead and anchor the text, set some SVG properties and CSS type properties, and we set its X and Y values. And once again, we use the X scale plus half of the width of the range band, so half of the width of one of those bars to set where the X should be, and then we go ahead and, again, fix Y for the inverted drawing, and we're done. Sound pretty cool? All right. So we're starting to make sense of how this thing works and how we draw with it, how we append data to it, how we can even do scaling so that, you know, if I want to make this thing now, sorry, it was 250 here. If I want to make this thing 400 and run it, oh my God, it still works.
Oh.
All I had to do is change the height. Everything else is scaled perfectly. So that's why some of these functions are really powerful. Now, I wanted to make an alternate version of this example where, you know, we've talked about correcting from, you know, bottom or the height minus the value kind of thing. I flipped that around and made this a little simpler. So now, I want to go back just so you can see. I map the range to go from 0 to max data set value is mapped to 0 to height of the SVG. Now we're going to do something a little different. We're going to map 0 to max data set value to height, from height to 0. So we've inverted the scale. And what that's going to do then is 0 is now down here. So a 0 value for y gets mapped to the height of the scale, and as you go up, we get closer and closer to 0. And so that means our y functions just got a whole lot nicer. Now, the downside is I still have to factor that into the height of it. So you can't ever fully get away from this thing. It will chase you down. But I wanted to show how, you know, normally you would think, well, I'm mapping an increasing set to an increasing set. But you can actually map an increasing set to a decreasing set, and it will properly flow those values through, which is pretty cool. All right, so this is all good, but what if you're building an interesting web application, maybe a dashboarding type application or something like that, where you want to actually flow values or let people change the ranges and update everything that they're seeing and do this in a very slick, you know, single page app kind of way. Well, that's really cool. We don't know how to do that yet. So it's pretty easy. We need to set some trigger, button click, a timeout or something, and then we need to rebind the data. That's all you have to do. This is why, Josh, this is exactly why I'm saying this has got that kind of React flow to it. You just have to, you're updating your state, essentially, like React. Only thing we need to do is redefine the values that change. So we're going to see that my updates here aren't going to, we're not going to have to redefine everything. But the ones that are functional, that are based on functions, we're going to have to redefine those. So once again, we set the width and height. We set up width and height variables. We set a data set. We set our scales. Here we're seeing these same things over and over. We create an SVG element. We go ahead and set up our bars, and we go ahead and create our labels, and then we go ahead, and that's where we left off last time. So now we have a click handler. And you'll notice this time I finally included something in the HTML up here. Just a p tag with the word click in it. And we go ahead and select that. So once again, we're back to doing it. This is using that select function for a slightly different purpose. We're trying to grab a DOM element, but instead of trying to attach data to it, we're attaching a click handler. So on click, we're going to run this function. And what we're going to do here first is we're going to go ahead and set up we're going to blank out data set and push in a bunch of random values. We're going to create another data set of the same exact length. If you notice that num values, it's popped in here. And now we're going to go ahead and requery our SVG elements and rebind. So using that SVG that SVG variable that we got way back here, we're capturing it inside of the closure for this this click handler. We're going to go ahead and select all the rectangles again. We're going to go ahead and rebind the data, and we're going to go ahead and set the attributes for y and height, because that allows us to redraw the rectangle correctly. And we're going to reset the fill color, because remember we associate the fill color with the value itself as well, not just the height. And then the same thing with the text, we need to reset its Did I delete something actually? Well, this could get interesting really fast. I don't think the text is going to update correctly. There we go. Now you see why this is a problem. So when we click, we should get a bunch of random values. And our values didn't update, just like I said. Let's see if we can actually fix that. Text. Function D. Turn D. Oh!
Oh,
Thank you.
You did that on purpose.
But no, actually, I really did. It's a great demo piece, but it's a great demo piece. I wish I'd had the foresight. So that's great, but it's really jarring. This is not the beauty that we're really expecting from the reputation of D3. That this thing's supposed to make some really powerful, beautiful visualization. A bunch of stuff popping all over the place is not at all what we want. So let's fix that. Transitions. So we have a couple of methods. I'm gonna try to give some coverage of each of these. We're getting into the stuff that's a little fuzzier in my memory, so I'm gonna try to give the best explanation I can of all of these. But key methods are transition to kick off a transition, duration to set how long it should run, delay to set how long it should wait before it runs, ease, if any of you are familiar with easing functions like bounces and linear and things like that, we're actually not gonna, I don't have any examples with easing because I forgot that this existed until I had already set up my example. And also remove, which actually removes things from the SVG. Now one of the, or actually, I should say not necessarily from the SVG, but from the thing you have control over with D3. One of the things I should point out is you can draw, you don't have to use SVG, just people like to do it because of the scalability and things like that. You know, one of the first examples I ever saw doing a lot of the stuff that I bypassed in the process of this is instead of drawing with SVG rectangles, your bar chart, you can go ahead and draw with divs. It's nothing that says we have to use SVG. It's just that you can do a lot of really beautiful things with SVG. You can do clip paths, you can do axes really quickly. There's a lot of things that draw out really nicely that would take a lot more work if you were to do this with a bunch of divs with absolute positioning. Like, blow my brains out before I have to do that much like crazy CSS to get this thing in the right spot. So one other thing, we talked about exit earlier on, and we're going to finally see exit come in. So
pretty cool.
exit was the thing, we talked about enter is when we're bringing things in. Well, when we remove something, we're going to do exit. Make sure I know which. Okay, I know exactly what I'm doing. All right, so set up width and height. We set up a data set. Now, this one, we're going to come back to this bit here when we actually get into it. We set up our scales. We set up our SVG element. We go ahead and draw our bars. We go ahead and draw our labels. We've seen this stuff before. We understand it well enough to get, you know. All right, so now we're back to that click handler. We're going to go ahead and push some random data into the array. We're going to go at this time, instead of changing all the values, I want to add a random value to the end and take one off the beginning. That's the goal. And it looks like we're doing that. The data set, we're pushing one onto the end, and shift strips the first value. Should be no big deal, right? This thing should just nicely slide things in and out. We're going to go ahead and select all the bars and all of the text, because we're going to handle, that's the easiest way for me to go ahead and manipulate each of them separately. We're going to set up exiting for the bars first. We're going to start a transition of duration 500 milliseconds. And each one is going to get delayed by the value of its index times 70 milliseconds. And the attribute, the X attribute is going to be minus the value of the range band. So the idea is try to shift it to the right Sorry, that's not correct. Bars exiting should be, so minus X scale range band. Remember, range band is the width of one of those bands. So minus that on the X scale would actually be off the canvas, off of the outside of the SVG element. So this is something that's exiting. So the idea is that it should transition into position off of the outside of the SVG element, and then it should get removed. And entering items, we want to go ahead and append a rectangle and set up all of its values. Its X value should be all the way at the full width, which remember we start drawing in the upper left, so the rest of it should be drawn off outside of the SVG's viewing area. And we set up the width and all that stuff like we've done before. And then we want to slide existing bars. So each one of them should get, we're going to run through and make each one of them go red, and then transition them back to their original color with all of their original values. And we're going to go ahead and slide the text. The text we don't do anything really exciting with. That's just my text. So let's just run this and see what happens and see if it sounds like what I described. These things, like I said, things should be sliding. Close.
Cool.
So, like I said, we were gonna, as we went through each of them, we're popping red onto it. So we have this cool red wave effect, but where's my sliding? I mean, they slid up and down to their correct values in a nice transition, but I said we were gonna enter new elements and we were gonna exit old elements, right? What happened? Luke, do you know? You asked the question earlier.
Did you just get rid of them? Like was there no animation? Are they just gone?
So they are gone.
Yeah.
We are in fact sliding values in the array behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is SVG has no idea that I changed them actually sliding the data, because all it's looking at is index positions. It's able to identify, well, this was the one in index 0, now this is the new value in index 0. So we need to create these kinds of smooth transitions where things can slide, we can actually move things around on the screen. We need to have data joins. And that means essentially a way to be able to track the data as it moves around. The default method of doing the data join is on the index in the array, the index that we were binding in. If we supply our own keys for identifying which one is which, then we can enable smooth transitions, and we do that through a key function. So let's go ahead and look at that exact same example with a little tweak. So this. On data, when we're binding the data set, we define a function. I should back up because I did something that actually, sorry, I didn't explain. I said I was going to come back to this earlier on the last example because it was left, I actually made the last example from this one because I really wanted to show you why we need these key functions and data joins. So we start with that same raw data set. We're going to go ahead and process that into something else. So we're going to map this data set across a function that actually spits out a key value pair. I just call them K and V. So the value from the data set ends up in V, and K ends up being its index. But that allows us to, that's just the initial setup. What we do to track those keys and do our data join properly is on data, we don't just send in the data set anymore, we send in a second argument, which is the function used to identify what property on each object in our array has the key. Just so that you guys see what I did. Dataset raw got mapped to dataset, and dataset, so that's the list of objects that have keys and values. That's what we're going ahead and using this key function for. So now down here, when we push things in, when I push a new object into the data set, I give it a random value, but I go ahead and give it a key equal to the last, The last element in the data, the current data set's key plus 1. So if we have, right, when we get this thing started up, we have, let's say, 20 elements. So that's 0 to 19. The last one's key is 19. 19 plus 1, we bring in 20. So I shift out 1, I bring in 20. I shift out 2, I bring in 22. All the rest of the code, take my word for it, is the same. Boom. So now I can transition in and out elements. And so we've seen enter work, we've seen exit work, we've seen transitions work. This is pretty cool, but that's a lot of work. We've got 130 lines of code. I don't even have axes. I don't have interactivity. Like, we haven't even talked about the fact that you can do pie charts, you can do the stack charts, force layouts, which I'll show you an example of one of those, which we're not even going to talk about that. The reason we're not talking about that is because I didn't read that chapter. So that's a lot. I mean, you could write a book on this. Someone did. But you say that, like I said, that's a lot of work. 130 lines of code. We don't even have a complete graph, and then I got to wire it up to some callback, to some AJAX calls so I can update my graph and all this stuff. There's no way. There's no way. I'm lazy. I am too lazy for that. So I promised something called C3. Comfortable, customizable, controllable. It is a library that sits on top of D3 and lets us do way cool stuff with a whole lot less code because they already wrote it. So, and the reason I advocate, if you're just trying to do, I want some bar charts, line charts, scatter plots, that kind of stuff, this is way better than you're going to pull off in a day, a week, probably even a month, because they thought of like everything. It's an open source project that's sitting out on GitHub, it's taking pull requests. I've sent one in, but they haven't merged it yet. It's way more than you could. Now that we've gone through all this, looking at what they do, it's pretty crazy. It's highly configurable, easier than D3. They have line charts, bar charts, scatter, pie, donut, and more. Take a quick visit to their website because we can start to see what all I can do. So we can bring in extra lines. We can go ahead and select data points, unselect them, focus. We can have popovers as I mouse over it, seeing the actual numeric values. Add special labels. Like let's say you were trying to show someone a metric where it was, there was a 100% line or a target goal, and you wanted to show people a frame of reference for whether or not they hit that goal. You could do that. So.
And all those things are going through, all those verbs are like functions that you call them pretty much in here?
So all of these things are different things you can set on there. I have not done all of them, so I can't give you examples of all of them, but I prepped a couple. I prepped 2 examples myself that are loosely based on some of their examples, and they've got, just so you guys can see, they've got a whole bunch of examples on their website. The documentation's actually pretty solid. Like I was really impressed with this. At work, I'm in fact doing some graphing things, and I started out and I sat down and I barreled through a book on D3 and I did all the examples. Actually, a lot of our examples that we worked through are examples that I did, modified versions of the ones that I did while reading the book. And I was like, gosh, there's got to be an easier way to do this because there's no way I can hit my deadline and still make really great looking charts and graphs. So I said, somebody has to build a library to sit on top of this library. And sure enough, there are a couple out there, and I like C3. My experience with it has been really positive. A lot of these things, like if you actually go into the dev tools, you can find, like they set nice classes on all of these SVG elements, so you can go in and be like, I want all my dots to be, like we talked about that, we talked about the stroke around a circle. So one of the things that one of my coworkers and I did is we figured out what these dots all were, and we went ahead and enlarged we changed their R through CSS, and then we added a stroke through CSS and all that. So we were able to add that little nice halo effect to all of these dots. So we had a dark background, we wanted the white halo around blue dots and stuff like that. We were able to do all that stuff through CSS. But remember, we can style, even though the SVG properties aren't valid CSS values, because of the way that CSS works, we can actually go ahead and manipulate those values on those elements in CSS using the SVG attributes and their corresponding appropriate values. So we're not going to get any of this. We talked about, I told you about force diagrams.
Yeah.
This is a force diagram. An interactive one with collapsible nodes.
How long did it take you to write that?
I did not write that. I told you I didn't read that chapter. No, this is from one of the I don't know if the creator of D3 actually wrote this, but it's on, if you notice up here, M. Bostock. That's it, the D3 library is under his GitHub account. And if you go to their whole website's really slick, I mean. But they've got all kinds of really crazy examples like that that are way beyond the scope of what we're talking about. My original title for this talk was Intro to D3, not crazy advanced force diagrams in D3.
What was the last website?
D3.js. It's on the D.
It was on the bottom of the screen.
Oh,
I
sorry.
already got that one, but right there, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm gonna post the slides and everything. So anyone that wants to go back through, the nice thing about all these being fiddles is you guys, JS fiddles, is you can go ahead and play with these on the web, run them, fork them, make them, make your own copies of them. Feel free. I thought that'd be even easier than doing GitHub for this because I can run the examples here. You can go home and run the examples the exact same without having to set up a web server. So let's talk about that bar chart again. We're not going to reproduce the exact same one with all the exact same data, but all we need to do is var chart equals c3.generate and then pass the config object. Done. I'm done. That's a whole lot easier. So let's go ahead and look at what that looks like. And that's it. That's I have a chart with popovers, and I can get rid of some of my elements. Like, that's way cooler than what I had. It doesn't have a wave, but it doesn't do the wave, but I mean, the popover is it has axes. I'll tell you one thing mine didn't do was it didn't resize like that correctly. If I drag mine around, it's just like, hey, I'm still here. No, so this is a really powerful library because they've set up all the hooks already for all of this stuff. And all I feed this thing is some data here, and there's 3 different ways you can feed data into this. The examples they use on their website almost all use the columns style, which is where you do you have an array of columns, and each one of those is an array. And the first element in the array is the name that should go down here, and then the rest of the array is the data. I don't like that style because that works for JavaScript really well, but if you're coming from .NET, which is where my backend is, it's really hard to send an array to the client side that is unless you have a list of object or a list of dynamic, you're not going to get something that is string first followed by a bunch of integers. Strongly typed languages don't like that. So here we can go ahead and send down a list of integers and then go ahead and send down and attach it, put that as a property in an object, and as long as we know the name of that property, we can declare the key. So I went ahead and, actually, sorry, you can have a list of objects that represent maybe rows in your database, for example. You want to graph out certain things in it. long as you know the names of the properties on each one of those objects, then you can go ahead and say, A is going to be one of my values to graph, B is going to be one of my values to graph. We can make C a value to graph. Or we can say C is actually the labels for the x-axis. And now you see the x-axis labels change to match our C values, and they're paired up correctly. When I didn't put this in here, it just assumed that the indices of the array were the x values, which is why we get 0 through 3. If I change this to line, I now have a whole different chart. That's pretty slick. So you can write one set of code and just feed it bar or line, and now you have a really easy way to generate 2 different types of graphs. We can play around with the widths. I can go ahead and manipulate. This would have worked better if I had a proper delete key. Thanks, Apple. Just saying. And now I've set it so that the y-axis, the y-axis, the one that goes up and down. I have to remember this one. Y-axis can only have 3 ticks, and the format is 2 decimal places. There's a whole bit about how to do these formatted. It's fixed 2 decimal places, I believe, is what that one stands for. But that's pretty cool. So now I've got, and there's a whole bunch of configuration options that you can do here. I'm just showing you a couple of them. You can do time series data with this really easily, which enables a whole other set of options for formatting dates and things like that. You can see this is a very versatile library that allows you to do really powerful graphing without hundreds, thousands of lines of your own handwritten code with blood, sweat, and tears. Let's talk about updating. That would seem to be one of the harder parts. Once we've wrapped our head around the general idea of D3, you still have to wrap your head around updating and rebinding, and the end. Now you have to wrap your head around the transitions and the exits. They handle all the transitions for you, so all you have to do is figure out how to load. And loading is actually even easier than setting up a chart. We just call load on that chart. So this is C3.generate returns a chart. We want to hold on to it so that we can update it. If you're not going to update it, you could just do C3.generate. But since we're going to update it, we want to hold on to that object so that we can call load on it. This has a simpler config that we pass into it, because you don't reconfigure every single piece about the graph. But I have a timer set that automatically brings in. So we set up A and B, and we load in. In my case, I'm reloading the same data. We could go ahead and create a new data set. In fact, let's do that. That should be interesting enough. Wait 2.5 seconds and bam, data loads in. We brought in a whole nother column that we didn't, and a whole other column that we didn't have before. We shrunk down data in the other one, so you can see that it's dynamically doing this stuff. It does nice transitions. Like this is pretty slick. So that's what I've got. One other example, actually how I have been using this, if you're an Angular user, easy way to start doing this, go ahead and make yourself a directive that creates the chart. On load, have it query your server for initial data, append that chart to the DOM, and then when you do your update by the user, like if they hit a button that causes it to requery, make your Ajax call the server, and then call chart load with your new data, and you're done. Like I've got multiple directives that do this kind of thing with error handling and everything, and I think they max out at like 130 lines or 150 lines, somewhere in that neighborhood. It's way better. I spent that many lines just making a chart with no axes, no scaling, no nothing. if you're doing this kind of stuff and you don't have very specific needs, very niche needs for your graphing, you're way better off using a library like this. And then where you need to get around the edges and maybe add something special, you can go back down to that low level D3 and still do that. So that's what I've got.
Can you do that on top of one of those charts? Like once you've built one with C3, can you manipulate it further with D3?
You probably could. I have not tried. Good luck. Feel free to look me up on Twitter. I'm hoping to have a blog post about this sometime soon, but I don't know if it'll be before we put the video up and all that. Does anybody have questions? I know there's been a lot of stuff I packed in here, and I'm sure I've missed some things. It's been a while since I read the book, and Charlie.
I just want to say I'm pretty disappointed that the C3 example did not exactly mimic the D3 example.
I thought about it, but I had like 20 minutes to prep my C3 examples, which speaks to the power of C3, I should say.
Yeah.
I spent, I was working last night and today on my D3 examples, and they were already mostly written. I was just cleaning up the code. Like, I didn't write those things from scratch today. I wrote my C3 examples. I grabbed some of their examples, and I was like, yeah, I don't want that. I swapped from columns to JSON, from their columns method to JSON method of loading data. Like, it speaks to the power of, if you're trying to just build some stuff to like show dashboarding to a user, C3 is a much easier way to go. One thing I should point out, you need to read the requirements on C3. You have to load in D3 separately, so you still have to include D3 and then include C3 after that, your script tags. C3 has its own version dependencies on D3. I think D3 is now at like 3.5 something, although if you go use the fiddles, they're still stuck on 3.04, I think. I don't know why. But the fiddle I had for C3, if you go to the GitHub repo for C3, they have a fiddle already out there that you can fork that already has the library uploaded and all plugged into it. That's how I got mine. Save you some time if you're trying to do some examples and test some things out there. So I hope this has been interesting and informative. I've worked with other libraries in the past. There's one that I know of that does similar stuff called HighCharts, but HighCharts has a limitation on its licensing that you can't use it for commercial products. C3 doesn't have this limitation, which is why I really like it, because I could do it. I could use it for work.
Do you use Chart.js at all? I was just curious.
I looked into a bunch of other libraries. Is that one of the ones that's canvas based?
Yes.
I didn't. I looked at that one and a number of others that were canvas based. I like the SVG based ones because I think they're a little crisper. Once you get to canvas, you're forced into, like, unless they do some good anti-aliasing kind of stuff, you're still getting that raster graphics feel in, like, for example, if you have like a pie chart or a donut chart or something like that, anything that's got arcs and stuff like that, I get a little nervous when I start to think of raster graphics. I start to think about, I want really crisp, sharp stuff, and SVG was tailor-made for that. So that's why I shied away from doing that. And I think D3, in terms of the data visualization community, D3 has the most heat around it because it's been around for a long time. It's a well-established thing in that space. Partly because of just some of the power behind it. I mean, you can see it's really not. I don't know that it was necessarily designed to be just a data visualization library. It's really a DOM manipulation library that happens to lend itself very well to data visualization because of its declarative syntax and data binding capabilities. So it's powerful, but it's like C. It's one of those low-level things. You really have to understand it, be willing to put in the time with it to be able to get really powerful results. I don't know. Joel?
You mentioned C3 was one of the libraries that extends it. So there were maybe another one or two that you looked at?
I looked at NVD3, I think. NVD3.js, I think, was one of the others. There was something in its syntax that I wasn't stoked about, and I liked the syntax of this one. It was very simple. It was just, grab the C3.generate config object. Here you go. As soon as I saw it, I was like, yeah, I could totally just hook that up to some, to some buttons in Angular and run with this. I can just wrap this thing up in a directive and we're good to go. And because directives give you the element that you're attached to, I just shove that into my D3 select out the element, and I'm off and running to attach my chart. Like it became really, really easy to go ahead and attach this stuff.
Did you ever look at another one? I think is Vega. Is based on D3 too. I don't know.
Not
you have
familiar
to cross
with that
it.
I spent, it's one of those things, find as many good libraries in as little time as possible and then come up with an answer. And C3 fit the bill for what we were looking for. So
do you know if it has TypeScript? If anyone's done like a definitely type before?
I don't know about that.
That's pretty cool.
Anybody? No more? I'd be happy to answer what questions I can afterwards. That's all I've got.